So this week, the research study that I focused on was, and the way I titled it was, New Study Shows How Leaders Can Reduce Intergroup Conflict. And essentially what this study was about was looking at the relationship between how a leader promotes a group's social identity, and how the people in that group evaluate the leader based upon their own identity distinctiveness threat, and as that's taking play. And so essentially, the question was, with identity distinctiveness threat as the moderator, how does a leader's promotion of a collective identity, dual identity, relation, and its intergroup relational identity impact their evaluation? And to just give a quick background on what each of those terms mean. So a collective identity is, what it involves is, so the idea here is if you have two groups that need to work together to some degree on a project, a leader can assign certain social identities to that group in order for them to be more productive or not. And so a collective identity and promoting that means recategorizing all group members from their original groups into a single larger group. So not really paying attention to those individual group identities, just focusing on the larger group identity. A dual identity consists of retaining individual group identities and then imposing a superordinate kind of common group on everyone that everyone can be a part of. And then an intergroup relational identity focuses on promoting the individual group identity differences as mutually beneficial and an interdependent sort of collaboration. And so the question here is, if a leader promotes a collective identity or a dual identity intergroup relational identity, how will groups feel threatened of their individual group identities and rate them or evaluate them more poorly or more beneficially for them or favorably based on how they do this? So that's the question. And the way that this study was conducted was data were collected from 184 undergraduate students at a Canadian university. Leader evaluation was the dependent variable, and it was measured through measuring leader evaluation in general, leader trust, leader support, and leader effectiveness. Participants, the way it was processed was participants filled out demographic information and then filled out statements which measured how strongly they identified with their university psychology department as their as their group identity, I guess. That was kind of what was taken. And participants read a vignette about a new student leader who was going to be a leader in the psychology department and implement these different changes. And the different vignettes focused on either promoting an intergroup relational identity, collective identity, or dual identity. And so after they read this, they measured their identity distinctiveness threats via a 5-item survey, and they rated statements on a scale of 1 to 9. And then leader evaluation was measured similarly. And what we found, or what they found through this, was when identity distinctiveness threat is low, participants favor a promotion of a collective group identity over an intergroup relational identity. So they prefer kind of forgetting about their own individual group identities for a common identity, but that's only when identity distinctiveness threat is low. And then dual group identity was moderately supported, kind of fell in between the two. It was it didn't go one way or another really. But when identity distinctiveness threat was high, participants wanted leaders to utilize an intergroup relational identity so they could retain their own individual group identities and recognize the benefits of those differences to work together. Collective identity messaging was least preferred in this case, and dual identity similarly fell in between the two. And so the key takeaway here is that when groups with strong identities collaborate in the workplace, leaders need to be cognizant of the role of identity for each of those individual groups and helping the groups work together. And ultimately, this, depending on how a leader structures this, it can lead to more or less intergroup conflict. So being aware of this is important because it can make groups more productive and obviously make them more productive. So it can reduce intergroup conflict and make them more productive. So that's what we have for this study. Do we have any questions, comments, discussion?
I'll jump in. I think that this study is really interesting. I was looking at it earlier before this started, and I almost expected, I know this is not really our brand, but I almost expected them to say that we should maybe like for some reason, maybe to mitigate like these conflicts, we should separate almost. I just think it's interesting the way that they said that leaders should try to cater to different group identities within the same group, as opposed to just kind of splitting off into groups that correspond with the different identities, if that makes sense. Because I think we talked about this earlier this week about how it's very common for people to kind of find similarities with someone and kind of cling to that group. For example, I think, Jeremy, you mentioned if you're an American traveling abroad, you find one other American, you're going to stick with that person. And so I think knowing that humans are very in-group, I just find this takeaway interesting, that people are still willing to be in group settings with people that have different identities, as long as the leader is catering to those different identities in that one group.
Yeah. Hi, Sarah.
Hi, everyone. I really like this. I missed a little bit of the beginning, I think, talking about who was studied, but this, I feel like this is ringing so many bells with, as Alyssa just said, you know, the psychology of bias, that panels discussion we just had, and just what the cultural training that we've been developing, like all this stuff is just ringing so many bells. And I'm wondering if this study said anything about, like, first off, what a strong identity, like what they mean by that, like, and then also, are they differentiating based on, like, on what, right? It's like, I think it's all about like how we use the differences. Like, so everybody says like, oh, appreciate differences and similarities, but like,
Yeah.
what does that mean, right? And like, how are you differentiating people? Is it based on like their outer identities, the color of their skin, the color of their hair, what, you know, that kind of stuff?
I think in this case they were using being part of the psychology department as their group, right? That was the measure.
Yeah.
That was the context of the.
That was the context. Yeah, and I can read the vignettes for you if you want to see the differences between the intergroup, relational, collective, and dual.
Okay, well, yeah, that might be helpful. Because I wanted to, I haven't actually, interesting, I mean, I haven't heard of these different segments of identity, and I'm wondering, because collective identity is pretty talked about a lot, but then these sort of dual identity and this intergroup relational identity, I just want to unpack those for a second, really understand what they mean by those, and tell me if this sounds right, because I'm just trying to reflect on what I heard, which collective identity is a sense of almost like a loss of personal identity and really merging with the collective. Is that
correct? Yeah.
Okay. And then dual identity is that a maintenance of both, some sort of maintenance of both personal and collective, or is that like two different collectives?
Yes. So it's you kind of involve yourself in both your individual groups, and then there's a superordinate collective identity that's dual identity, because you're still involving those the original understanding of your group.
But it's not a personal identity. It's like a dual collective identity, where it's like one is a subgroup and one's a superordinate group. Is that what they think they meant? Okay.
That's it.
So let's say that. And then the relational identity is focusing on one's group, but also with some understanding that it's interdependent with another group, so that there's some like sort of dependency on the exchange with another group.
Yeah, so I can read their definition here from one of the studies that they used. Was an intergroup relational identity entails a sense of identity that included or was even defined by the collaborative relationship existing with the other group. So promoting an intergroup relation identity, it provides a sense of identity that includes, that's about the collaborative relationship, essentially. So it doesn't discard the individual identity parts, but it just focuses on the collaborative identity.
Okay.
So kind of like when, Jeremy, I feel like you've used this in a training when you say like, okay, kind of create something new, right? Create a new subgroup identity, but then also, or is that Remember the
It could be
dissolving
dual.
training, dissolving conflict from within, and Henry had us kind of co-create that new identity. Is that what it's describing?
Well, it sounds like that might be dual. So what it sounds like is collective identity is the identity of me being part of this one group. And then dual identity is I'm both part of the psychology department and I'm also a part of the school. And those are two different basically identity groups, but I identify with both of them. One's a bigger superordinate group and one is this sort of immediate group. And then the relational identity could be like I'm a part of the psychology department, but the sociology department, we interact with a whole lot, and we really couldn't exist like the way we do without their participation in some way, right?
Yeah, I could actually let me read some of the vignettes here. That might be helpful to hear kind of hear the difference. So this was, I'll start with collective. So the collective identity was, they read this: the university's Department of Psychology is full of bright young students. Psychology majors are students either from the Faculty of Arts or Faculty of Science. Psychology students in both arts and science must understand that they are similar to one another and should work together to achieve common goals. Both groups benefit in part by this shared integrative group. Psychology students excel because these arts and science students have assimilated into being just psychology students. Rejecting this intergroup group divide, arts versus science, while emphasizing that we are all the same is what makes the Department of Psychology great. I hope that you will endorse me as a leader who represents a unified psychology department. So that's collective identity, because they're saying we need to reject this intergroup divide between arts and sciences students. Does that make sense? So that
sounds like relational identity. I love. Okay, let's hear the difference, because I'm curious.
Yeah. So I'll read the intergroup relational one, and that's very similar beginning. University's Department of Psychology is full of bright young students. Psychology majors are either students from Faculty of Arts or Faculty of Science. They must work together while maintaining their distinct and separate group identities to achieve common goals. Both groups benefit in part by the interdependent relationship. Psychology students excel because of the distinct and unique contribution each group makes. Maintaining this intergroup collaboration, arts versus science, while emphasizing each group's strengths is what makes the Department of Psychology great. I hope you will endorse me as a leader who represents both arts and psychology students. And so that's intergroup relational.
Okay, let's hear dual.
And then dual is very similar beginning. Let's see. So psychology majors are either students from Faculty of Arts or Faculty of Science. Art and science students from psychology can combine to tackle goals for the Department of Psychology. These students can think of themselves as both representing arts or science in the psychology department. Psychology benefits from having the unique contribution of both arts and science students in the department. Maintaining one group, psychology, while recognizing the strengths of arts and science students is what makes the Department of Psychology great. I hope that you will endorse me as a leader who represents the Department of Psychology. Does that make sense?
Okay.
A little bit.
Yeah. Now I get it. It's so the collective identity is really encompassing everyone. The dual identity is saying we're both this group and that group, and then the relational identity is we're this group, they're that group, but we interact and depend on each other.
Yeah.
Okay, now that makes sense. Okay, and then really quick, in terms of the methodology, let's see. So they fill out information and responded to identification, how closely they identify as a psychology department student, and then they read this vignette, and then some information. Okay, they read this vignette, and then they fill out a survey to see. To evaluate this leader, and then also a survey that measures their level of identity threat. Is that
correct? Yep. Okay. Yeah.
And so they wanted to see if there's a correlation between the type of leader with their adoption of the leader, and also if that relationship was somehow moderated by identity threat.
Yep. Exactly.
Okay.
Yep. And so essentially it was with the results here, when they rated their identity distinctiveness threat as low, they there was more favorable evaluations of the leader within a collective group identity. And the opposite was true when identity distinctiveness threat was high. Participants rated leaders higher when they used a intergroup relational identity.
There's high participants use intergroup relation leaders as collective identity measuring least preferred. Okay. Yeah. So someone reads this collective and they feel threatened, they don't prefer that leader. But someone reads the intergroup relational and they feel threatened and they have a high estimation of the leader.
Yeah, which to me makes sense, because if you're feeling threatened, you're going to want to find some sense of safety and comfort within your own individual group and what you know. And so I think it kind of relates to what Alyssa said earlier, but like it kind of makes sense to some degree that's, to me, like to want to retain that individual group identity while still knowing and I guess recognizing the benefits of the differences.
Yeah, because under collective identity, you're not acknowledging that identity that feels threatened. And so if I feel threatened and I also don't feel acknowledged, of course I'm not going to feel happy, right?
Yeah.
This is interesting. Thank you.